Reading 100 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 3, Great Animal House, December 6, 1947. Commentary on Increase of Consciousness. Work Idea. According to the teaching of this work, we are at the second level of consciousness, designated the so-called waking state, in which people hate and kill each other in the name of some theory, etc. The work teaches that mankind, being at this level, which is not proper consciousness, suffers in accordance with this state and is used for other purposes than are beneficial to it. It says before anything can become better, mankind, or a sufficient number of people, must reach the third level. Otherwise, no real change in the affairs of mankind can occur, and man will continue to swing between the opposites, war and peace, etc. In short, we here, each one, must undergo an increase in consciousness. The third level of consciousness, where outside help can reach us, is called the level of self-remembering, self-consciousness, or self-awareness. We seek to reach this level. Of course, in common fairness, everyone should. Well, start with yourself. Can you wake up a little? How then can we individually, through personal work, undergo an increase of consciousness? Now we come to a commentary on this central work idea of becoming more conscious and the consequences of remaining asleep in the second state. Commentary. One direction of increasing consciousness is making yourself more conscious to yourself. We spoke recently of the person who could not hear and of the person who was always out. As several people found the comments made on these two definitions given by Gurdjieff useful, let us speak about the person who always makes difficulties. On one occasion, Mr. Ouspensky said to me, "You always make difficulties." I was surprised. I thought at the time that this was really an absurd thing to say about me. It seemed so obvious to me, then, that it was O who always made difficulties. I never made them. So I was not only surprised but offended. Probably I thought to myself, what? Can he really mean that? Can he believe it is true, when for several months or years I have been carefully pointing out to him how difficult he is, and what difficulties he makes for me? Now I take this example in order to illustrate how, unless one becomes conscious of something in oneself, one cannot see it, cannot understand how it can possibly apply to oneself, and so cannot change it. Is it not clear that if you are not conscious of some quality in yourself, you are therefore not aware of it, and therefore cannot believe that you possess it, if someone else happens to point it out to you, and so you cannot change it? Consciousness and change are inseparable. A person has two things, a physical body and a psychological body. The knowledge of both is extremely faulty and erroneous, so people collide daily with one another. Now let us take only the psychological body, a person's psychology, your own personal psychology, through which you relate yourself to another person's psychology. A difficult matter indeed, because you are not aware of your own psychology, nor is the other person aware of his or her psychology. Both have 1,001 things in them that they are unconscious of, that they are not aware of, and yet that manifest themselves all the time. This is the general state of man asleep. So the work starts with self-observation. It says that it is necessary to know thyself, to quote the inscription written over the portico of the ancient Greek temple of Delphi, where there was an esoteric school that had clairvoyance, and which was acknowledged throughout the northeastern Mediterranean some 4,000 years ago. Yes, before we can start, we must know ourselves much better than we do in the running stream of life, and out of that knowledge we must become more responsible to one another and to ourselves. Otherwise, we do not really exist individually. Some time ago it was asked, what is psychology? The answer was, psychology can be said to be what you are not aware of. At that time we were speaking of the dark side of ourselves, by which is meant the side of ourselves that we do not see, are not aware of, and so do not acknowledge. Understand, you can be what you are not aware of. Yet this side acts all the time, and the tragedy is we do not see it. We are it, without knowing it, without having become conscious of it. So the work says, self-observation is necessary. It lets a ray of light into the inner darkness of ourselves. What is this ray of light? This ray of light means the light of consciousness, for consciousness is light, not sunlight, but spiritual light, psychological light. And the inner darkness means all that side, all those qualities that we are not conscious of, not aware of, and do not acknowledge. What is the result? What happens when, to take the example of myself, I cannot see that I make difficulties? I do not see it as myself, am not conscious of it, and so do not acknowledge it. Instead, I see it in another person. I see only that O makes difficulties, not me. The fault is in him, not in me. This is psychology. To borrow a word from my first psychological teacher, Dr. Jung, he said, we project onto others what we cannot accept in ourselves. Yes, you all know the jealous person who, not accepting his or her own thoughts of infidelity, projects them and accuses only the other person. Is this not the simplest example of what practical psychology means, and therefore of the necessity of self-observation and the gradual accepting of what is in oneself? Unfortunately, it is a very difficult thing to become aware of what we project onto others in the way of suspicion, slander, accusation, offendedness, dislike, hate, and all the rest. There is a machinery of buffers, attitudes, associations, negative emotions, pictures, considerings, vanities, and false personality that is very powerful and serves to keep us asleep in the grip of mechanical life, from which so few have the courage and clear thought to awaken at all costs. In other words, we do not see ourselves without long effort. We remain not conscious of ourselves unless we work. We project onto others what we should see in ourselves, if we retain the illusion that we are fully conscious. So the work speaks of the necessity of an increase of consciousness before a man can change. Man, it says, is not yet conscious. He attributes consciousness to himself. He does not realize that he is not yet conscious. A conscious man knows himself. A mechanical man imagines he does. Now, in regard to projecting into others what we do not see in ourselves, remember that this work says we are mirrors to one another. The object of self-observation, then, is to become more conscious of oneself. The great object of the work is to lead to a definite and possible destiny, a definite change of being. So I ask you again, can you change anything you are not conscious of? Obviously, if, as Mr. Ouspensky said, I always make difficulties, and if I am not conscious of it, how can I change it? To this practical point, I wish to call the attention of you all. If a person is not conscious of the fact that he or she speaks or acts in a certain way, can that person change it? No. It is quite clear that it is impossible. Now suppose you point out to the person that he or she speaks or behaves in this particular way. What will happen? Most likely you will be accused of unfairness. Why? Because the person concerned has no idea that it is true. The matter is not conscious to the person's mind. It is unconscious. What is the only remedy? The only remedy is for the person, after long self-observation, to realize personally that he or she speaks or behaves in this or that way. In that case, an increase of consciousness has taken place, and something has been added to consciousness. Is this person then the same? No. By seeing, by becoming more conscious, by accepting, by acknowledgement, the person is no longer the same. This is the way we follow in this work. A man who becomes more conscious cannot remain the same. So it is said that self-observation is a method of self-change. Now, in regard to the impossibility of altering anything that you are totally unconscious of, which is obvious, there comes in here the altering something that you are half conscious of, but will not acknowledge. This latter situation is due to a buffer. If you try to say anything about it to another, you will get probably a violent reaction and a great deal of self-justifying. This is always important and interesting to notice in oneself. It shows where a buffer lies. A buffer intervenes between two contradictory things in you, both of which, in a way, you are aware of, but not together at the same time. Let me return to the phrase, "You always make difficulties." For the moment, let us leave myself out. What do you understand by a person who always makes difficulties? Does this in any possible way apply to yourself? Do you tend to make difficulties? And if so, of what kind? Gardeners and cooks, I have noticed in the past, always seem to do so. No doubt, when I noticed this, I was bitter about what Mr. Ouspensky said to me. But perhaps some have a picture of always helping, lending a helping hand, I believe it is called, without noticing just how often and where you make a great many difficulties and are no help at all. Remember that in all your relationships with others, it is chiefly what you are not conscious of that complicates them. Another person may say, that you make extraordinary difficulties about your food, but you do not see it. Or he may observe that you invariably say no when asked to do anything, a point which you, of course, do not observe. On the contrary, you no doubt have a pleasant picture that you always are ready to do anything, or certainly would if you had the time. Or again, you may always disagree, and though you are not aware of it, others may be. This is a mode of making difficulties. But there are very many modes, as for instance, wanting to be first, to have power, and so objecting to everyone and everything, that does not give you this facility. This, of course, points to the inability to tolerate the idea that anything is higher than oneself, one of the commonest situations in self-adoration. So it is interesting to observe oneself from the angle of making difficulties, and we have to become more conscious in that direction. Remember that acknowledgement gives inner peace.